Welcome to the History Guy podcast, Counterfactuals. What is a counterfactual? In the context of studying history, it is a kind of analysis where we examine what might have happened had historical events gone differently. As a thought experiment, the goal is to learn and understand history as it is by talking about what it could have been. As a twist on the historical stories that we tell on the History Guy YouTube channel, this is a series of podcasts that dwell on that eternal question: what if? I'm Josh, a writer for the YouTube channel and son of the History Guy. If you're a fan of the channel, you already know Lance, the History Guy himself. To liven up our discussions on what might have happened, we have invited Brad Wagnon, history aficionado and a longtime friend of the History Guy, to join us. Remember that if you'd like to support us, you can find us on Patreon, YouTube, and locals.com. Join us as we discuss what deserves to be remembered and what might have been. On the first episode of what we're calling our second season, we're doing a two-parter. On today's episode, we talk about two close calls wherein presidents barely escaped with their lives, and speculate on what might have happened if they had died instead. Without further ado, let me introduce the History Guy.
Sometimes what almost happens in history is really as interesting as what did happen, or maybe what didn't. There's good reason to question the great man theory of history, the idea that single individuals drove historical events, but certainly there were individuals whose personalities or actions were important. If they hadn't been there, well, history might have turned out differently. Many times in history, national leaders have narrowly escaped death, and in a few of those instances, it might have ended, say, an important presidency before it even began, leaving us to wonder, what if? It's history that deserves to be remembered. In September of 1902, Theodore Roosevelt had been president for only a year after the assassination of William McKinley at the Pan American Exposition in 1901. The tragedy of one lost president was serious, but only a year later the nation very nearly lost a second president in less than 12 months. After McKinley's assassination, Congress informally requested that protection for the president be provided by the United States Secret Service, which had been established by legislation President Lincoln signed on the day he was assassinated, not to protect presidents, but to deal with rampant counterfeit currency. The Secret Service was one of only a handful of federal law enforcement agencies, which led to the service doing work outside of its initial assignment, investigating all manner of crimes. In 1894, the Secret Service did begin providing part-time informal protection of President Cleveland, and continued until Congress asked them to protect President Roosevelt full-time. Among the very first agents assigned to protect Roosevelt was William Craig. Craig was born in 1855 in Glasgow, Scotland, spent 12 years in the Royal Horse Guards of the British Army. He provided protection for Queen Victoria and served with the British Army in Egypt for a time. He was discharged at age 38 and migrated to Chicago, where he performed athletic feats and taught fencing and boxing. He was a noted fighter with a broadsword. In 1896, the Chicago Tribune wrote that no other swordsman in the country has ever attempted the startling feats which the professor performs with his broadsword. He joined the Secret Service in 1900, and in his initial service he hunted down counterfeiters in Birmingham, Alabama. Craig had actually been assigned to protect McKinley, as the Secret Service provided some protection when the president traveled out of Washington. He was present when McKinley was shot. Concerned about his safety, McKinley's personal secretary, George Cortelyou, had tried to cancel a public reception at the exposition, but when McKinley insisted, Cortelyou arranged for more protection. Since October of 1901, Craig had been assigned to Roosevelt and was a constant companion. The Vancouver Daily World of Vancouver, British Columbia said that at receptions, reviews, churches, pink teas or strolls through the White House grounds, Craig was never more than 10 feet from the president. The constant protection of the Secret Service actually annoyed Roosevelt, who managed to slip Craig's guard at least once. Still, Craig had become close with Roosevelt's family. Biographer Edmund Morris noted that Craig was friends with Theodore's young son Quentin. They read comics together. In the fall of 1902, Roosevelt left Washington to do a barnstorming tour to support candidates for the midterm elections. On September 1st, 1902, William Craig gave an interview to a member of the Worcester Telegram. "Too much caution cannot be taken to keep the crowds back from teams and the president," Craig said. He also said that whenever he stood near the president, he kept one hand on his revolver, constantly vigilant. But Craig couldn't protect Roosevelt from everything. On the morning of September 3rd, Roosevelt, Massachusetts Governor Winthrop Crane, Personal Secretary George Cortelyou, Craig, and a driver got into a barouche, a four-wheeled carriage pulled by four horses. Roosevelt had just given a speech at the city park and was traveling to give another at the country club. Pittsfield had a trolley system run by the Pittsfield Electric Street Railway. The Secret Service had ordered the trolley system closed, but the top brass of the railway company planned on reaching the club by riding one of the trolleys. Some of the riders were late, which put the trolley behind by 15 minutes. The carriage approached the trolley crossing when the party heard a rumble. The Evening Star of Washington, D.C. describes what happened next. An electric car was heard coming along at a great speed, apparently trying to pass ahead of the procession. Craig appreciated the danger, and he rose beside the driver and, turning around, signaled the motorman to hold back. The warning was disregarded, and in the next instant, in the view of hundreds of people, the electric car crashed diagonally across the carriage, causing the wheels to collapse, splintering the side and running down the near horse to the wheel team, killing it instantly. The riders were thrown from the carriage. The president landed on his face, but escaped with bruises and a cut. Governor Crane was essentially unhurt, while Cortelyou seemed concussed. Craig had been crushed under the trolley and was killed. "How my children will feel," Roosevelt said. Craig was remembered well. The Washington Post reported that everywhere yesterday were heard expressions of sorrow at the fate of William Craig. Scores of officials whose business takes them frequently to the White House had a kind word to say of the officer. Secretary of State John Hay thought that Roosevelt had only escaped death by 2 inches. And even so, the incident still almost killed the president. He was hurt enough to have to use a wheelchair for a time, and 3 weeks later was hospitalized in Indianapolis, where a doctor did an emergency surgery to prevent blood poisoning, which could have killed him just as easily as the crash. Roosevelt later quipped, "If you're set on risking your life, go to Pittsfield, Massachusetts, and take a trolley ride." The leg injury ailed him again after another accident while exploring in the Amazon in 1914, and the old accident once again brought the, by then former president, near to death, 12 years after it occurred. William Craig was the first of, as of the making of this video, just 37 Secret Service agents to have died on assignment. Roosevelt later said of him, "The man who was killed was someone of whom I was fond, whom I greatly prized for his loyalty and faithfulness." The driver of the trolley, who was rushing because he was late and his passengers were anxious to get to the president's speech, served 6 months in jail for manslaughter. There's no way to know how history might have been different if Theodore Roosevelt had died that day. He was, for example, at the time personally acting as a neutral arbiter in the coal strike of 1902, a watershed event in U.S. labor history. And at least his death would have been problematic. As he had replaced the assassinated William McKinley, there was no vice president in 1902. Years earlier, President-elect Franklin Pierce experienced another close call before he was even inaugurated. Widely considered one of America's worst presidents, he was also a man who suffered great tragedy. Before he was elected in 1852, Pierce and his wife Jane had lost 2 boys, one in infancy and another at age 4. Their last surviving son was Benjamin Pierce, called Benny. Weeks after his election in January 1853, Pierce and his family were returning to their home in New Hampshire from a funeral in Boston. Shortly after boarding at 1:15 p.m., the train, less than 3 miles from the station it left in Andover, Massachusetts, derailed. There came a violent jolt, followed by sudden wrenching and frightful jerking. The car's axle had broken, and it came off the tracks, sliding down an embankment at 40 miles an hour. 60 people were in the car with the Pierces when it crashed. The Huntington Globe reported the car was crushed to atoms, while the New York Times reported the car broke into pieces like a cigar box. Several people were injured, but only one person was killed. Benjamin Pierce, who was nearly decapitated by the wreckage. He had been standing at the time of the accident, looking out the window, at the passing scenery. The accident affected the president and his wife terribly. His wife was unable to attend his inauguration 2 months later, and she remained in mourning, not attending public events for the first 2 years of Pierce's presidency. Pierce was a doughboy politically, meaning he was a Northerner with Southern sympathies, and his actions, such as the Kansas-Nebraska Act and his enforcement of the Fugitive Slave Act, drove the country nearer to civil war. It has been suggested that the trauma of the accident caused depression, or even PTSD, which may have affected his performance as president. Had he died in the train accident, however, a unique problem may have faced the nation. Pierce served without a vice president, as his running mate, William Rufus King, had become sick in Cuba. King was unable to attend the inauguration because of his illness, and is the only executive official to have taken the oath of office on foreign soil. He died of tuberculosis 45 days into his term. Among historians, these historical what-ifs are called Counterfactuals, which the 2007 book Studying History describes as the idea of conjuring on what did not happen or what might have happened to understand what did happen. It's really impossible to say what would have happened if any of these events had turned out differently. If there had been a different leader or a question of leadership at these critical moments in history, maybe things would have been much different, or maybe not, as historical events are larger than any single person. But in any case, these particular events are not particularly well remembered because they didn't change history. And had the president died as a result of any of them, at very least we know that they would not have been nearly so forgotten. Almost history that deserves to be remembered.
Now for the exciting part. The history guy, Brad, and I discuss. What if Theodore Roosevelt died in that 1902 carriage accident? Or Franklin Pierce took his son Benny's place in 1853? So today we listened to a number of stories about various presidents and things that could have happened to them that would have had an impact on history. And I think you mentioned in the video that you talked about how you can't, we're not talking about
that would have had an impact in that, they might have died.
Yeah.
And they were, they were president. So, yes. So, this is, this particular episode, which actually Josh wrote, but that particular episode, it kind of begs that question. Since we had these close calls with people at interesting times, what would have happened if they had been successful? Yeah. Or if it hadn't at least gone the way that it was. And I think that's the idea of the podcast here. There's all sorts of things, but this is a great idea of it to say, we've had, and of course, these are just some examples. We've had quite a, there was an attempt on Reagan's life. Yep. There was an attempt on Ford's life. There was an attempt on Truman's life. And there's an attempt on, Donald Trump in July. And so, all of those, think how different it would be if Donald Trump hadn't turned his head. You would say that would certainly significantly impact the election that we're looking at today. So we can ask these questions about, these particular, we'll probably ask this about lots of these as we go along the podcast, but these are some good ones because they came at really, really interesting times. And interesting is that the three that we have on the list today came at different times in presidential succession rules. And so that's that means that we've got, different, it's a whole different thing over who would have been replacing them, and because two of them, at least, there wasn't a vice president, or essentially wasn't a vice president, I guess, with Pierce. But that's interesting too, because they operated by different rules. All that Article 1, Section 6 says is that the vice president takes over the duties of the president if the president becomes incapacitated, and that Congress can set rules for whatever succession comes after that. And interestingly, prior to the 25th Amendment, there was no set of rules to replace the vice president. So if the president died, the vice president became president. It wasn't even really clear at first that the vice president became president or whether they just took the duties of the president. That was an interesting question too. But there was so once the vice president moved up, there was no way to appoint a new vice president. And so you didn't have anybody that was waiting in the wing. Vice president's an absolutely worthless position until it's the most important one. And so then we have all these weird different rules about who would be in charge at different times. And that's all quite interesting.
Absolutely. And they changed, depending on who we were going to choose.
They did. It was, I think, 1798 and then 1886 is when the rules were made. And so they're different rules, and then 1947. So we have three different sets of rules, and so it's three different ideas of who would have replaced if they became, which is really fascinating. Yeah. And so when we ask here, because part of the question would be, there's a big question here because if the president dies, that impacts the nation. And so however you want to put it, that impacts the nation. And some of these, we're talking about, the right as they were elected or right as they were replaced. So like Theodore Roosevelt, McKinley had just died. That absolutely shocked the nation. If Roosevelt had died when his carriage got hit by a streetcar, that soon thereafter, it wasn't just a matter of we didn't have a vice president. It was also a matter of how well does the nation accept losing leaders that quickly and replacing leaders that quickly. And that's an interesting question too. Plus, there's an interesting question if you don't I guess I'm dominating the conversation. There's an interesting question because there were other people involved too. So in Roosevelt's carriage was William Craig, who was the first real Secret Service agent assigned to protect the president. William Craig was squashed under a streetcar. Yeah. What might William Craig have done if he hadn't died? That's an interesting question. Yeah. And how that might have impacted history. Maybe it's hard to tell. Maybe not a lot, maybe a lot. So I mean, these really do raise an interesting question.
Yeah, certainly. And, to your point, I think that there was, I think that when you have a major leader die, you have two sorts of effects. You have the immediate effect. What is the immediate effect on the nation? What does the succession look like? What crises might the country be involved in when a president or a senior official passes who has a direct bearing upon whatever this crisis is?
Because we have never had to go beneath the vice president to find the president. I guess you could say that kind of with Ford, but Ford had been appointed as vice president under the 25th Amendment. So we've never asked that question, what happens if we lose both the president and the vice president and we're going to someone who did not run for that office, who's in a different position? And that's really interesting, especially with Roosevelt. That was under the law, the 1886 law. And so it didn't include the president of the Senate. It didn't include the Speaker of the House. It would immediately to the cabinet secretaries in the order that the positions were created. So with Theodore Roosevelt, it would have been the Secretary of State. And that's a different, now that's kind of down the order of succession. And it's interesting because that Secretary of State is a very famous man who's very important to American politics even outside of that. So it would be fascinating to ask, what if John Hay had run for president? But what if John Hay had become president because Theodore Roosevelt was squished by a streetcar? That's a really interesting question.
Yeah, we did an episode on John Hay too.
Yeah, we did. Yeah. I mean, he totally changed U.S. politics. He changed foreign policy. He's the guy that mostly moved us from kind of a backwater state to a state that was playing on the international stage. He rebuilt the relationship with the United Kingdom. I mean, so this is not a backseater. But on the other hand, he never was a guy who was running for office. He was always a cabinet sort of guy. He was Abraham Lincoln's secretary is where he started. So, I mean, how much would the nation have accepted someone who had never been a politician suddenly become president? I mean, that happened in Battlestar Galactica, but I mean...
Well, two things that the conversation brings up. First of all, very few of us who are beneath about 55, maybe 60 years of age, so Lance about you're in my generation, have any meaningful memories of Spiro T. Agnew.
Oh, yeah.
And how, as he was removed for office as the vice president due to criminal activities, and then Richard Nixon was impeached and chose to.
Yes. So we saw that process. Ford had not been, though Ford was a politician, he had been Speaker of the House or had been a minority leader of the House. So, I mean, it's a little bit different. But I mean, the 25th Amendment was created for a reason. So this is the closest, I mean, these are a couple of the instances where it was maybe closest to something like that happening, to asking the question, what happens if you've lost both the president and the vice president? Because prior to the 25th Amendment, you couldn't replace the vice president. So Ford was unique, but Ford had been appointed through the process as vice president, and clearly they gave Agnew that way out in order to get Ford in, because they knew that Nixon was already in trouble and they wanted to have something in place. So we clearly know that would be a crisis if we had to make this sort of shift. Also interesting about Roosevelt, though, is that John Hay, who was the Secretary of State, who would have become president, John Hay died in 1905. He would not have run for a second term. So also what's interesting with Roosevelt is it's not just a matter of who would have replaced him in that first term, but Roosevelt had taken control of the party, dominated the election in 1904. If there hadn't been a Roosevelt there, and the Republican, Hay would not have run. He was sick by that point. Then the more important question might be what happens in what was Roosevelt's second term, because that's the term that would have changed if Roosevelt had died when he got hit by that streetcar. Is that he wouldn't have been there for that second term? Because in terms of John Hay stayed in the Roosevelt administration. And so it's a little harder to see how different would a Hay administration have been from a Roosevelt administration. But it's a bigger question, or maybe a broader issue, to say how different would the 1904 election have been, and what might have happened there, because that could be a much a much more different, because the Republicans may well have not nominated a reformer, a progressive like Roosevelt. They might have nominated, like a Breckinridge, who was a conservative and very different, and we might not have gotten, say, the square deal. Or the Democrats, because they kind of just ran a dude because Roosevelt was going to win. But what if Bryan, who had run the 2 times before, what if Bryan had decided to get in the race? It's easy to ask the question: what would happen if William Jennings Bryan had been elected in 1896 was it? Yeah, in 1896, because he might have avoided the Spanish-American War. He was an isolationist. But there's fewer questions. I'd say, what if Bryan had come in 1904? And that could have been very interesting, because if Bryan had run against a less popular Republican, then it's possible that we have a Democratic victory there, and William Jennings Bryan, that always has run, might have been president. What would happen? I mean, would we have moved to free silver? And he was a very different. He would be radically different than if we'd had a Roosevelt administration. So it's really it's a very fun question here to say, because it's not just his first term. It's the fact that the second term with Roosevelt really came because of Roosevelt. And even after that, because Taft was really the descendant of Roosevelt.
And then in 1912, the reason the Democrats won was primarily...
And it's because Roosevelt comes back and runs. Yeah, so we're talking the next 3, at least, presidential elections being radically impacted if Theodore Roosevelt gets hit by a streetcar.
Now, another... I'd like to make this point before I forget it, because, well, there are shiny things, and I am easily distracted. But we are also dealing with at least 3 different periods in history regarding communications. So a Pierce presidential transition would occur at a time in which it would be assumed that California wouldn't even hear that Pierce had been killed. Actually, I do take that back. I believe that we do have telegraphs at that point, but it would not have had the same immediacy as it did.
I'm not sure. Do we have transcontinental telegraph in 1840?
1853.
That was 1853. Probably, yeah, you're right.
Okay.
It would have been but it wouldn't have been instantaneous. Yeah, you're right, and it would have spread among the public a lot more slowly. That's interesting. You're right, because I think the time of Roosevelt in 1901, the audience or the nation would have known pretty quickly what was going on. I think they were pretty well informed about what happened with McKinley, but it was a different nation, and there was an awful lot of rural part of the nation and things like that. So you're right, it's an interesting question.
And then one more route that I'd like to follow down before I forget it is that we also have to remember that especially the Pierce administration, that is during these United States of America history of the United States versus the United States of America. So, Pierce is president at a time pre-Civil War where the states have quite a bit more autonomy than they do currently. And the presidency is, I don't want to say tenuous, but I do want to say that it is a lot less directly impactful, or perhaps much less monolithic than it was even in the early 1900s. And then certainly with Franklin Delano Roosevelt, we essentially are looking at, especially during wartime, almost, to almost dictatorial power. Though that is before, but it honestly, in the end, after Hoover and in the Great Depression, then certainly the president had a lot more authority. That's a good point. We're still kind of learning who the president is. When we're talking about Pierce. Yeah, a fact that really shocked me was when I was looking at the where the federal revenue during 1902, 1903, 33% of it was coming off of tariffs.
Yeah, that was a different. When I read, I've read a lot of presidential biographies. And they're all, throughout the whole 19th century and then into the 20th, they were always fighting about tariffs and what tariffs whether we were protecting industry and it's kind of incredible because, well, except for that we had some in the last administration, we talked about tariffs for the most part, tariffs are not the big issue these days.
You said that they're not big revenue streams.
And also that,
Now tariffs are used for a whole different purpose. They really are, about trade or trade imbalance or whatever. But for a long time, you're right. As an isolationist nation, tariffs were the way that we were funding things, and those lead to. Of course, there's big financial questions here because I talked about when you're talking about Bryan, then you're talking about free silver versus the gold standard, and some will ask. I mean, I don't know that you can economically really support this argument. So some would say that if Bryan had become president in 1904 and had been able to move us to free silver, that could have prevented the Depression, the Great Depression. Because it certainly would have impacted the money supply. That's a radical question, how radical is a change? So I guess the first question, if we're talking about Theodore Roosevelt, is how different would a John Hay administration have been, as opposed to the first term of Theodore Roosevelt? How much would that have impacted the nation?
Certainly, John Hay was not as powerful a personality as Theodore Roosevelt, and he was a much more. I mean, he was an ambassador for much of his career. And he did great at that job. But you wonder if he had the temperament for some of the more bitter things that people were fighting about in politics. And I think he also probably would have faced, as the first person to have come not just from the not a vice president, but into the cabinet, that he wasn't elected to that position, and I think that would have been difficult.
Because at a period when it wasn't almost any other time, then it would have been the Speaker of the House or the President of the Senate, someone who had legislative experience. But Hay was not used to working with Congress or not used to working in Congress. I think that's interesting. I think certainly Hay would not have done what Roosevelt did in terms of unifying the Republican Party, and create, and that makes a big difference going forward in terms of. How maybe then you don't have a Coolidge administration, you don't have a Hoover administration. Certainly, there's a very good chance you don't get a Taft administration. So, I mean, it could have impacted politics a long way going forward. As a matter of fact, that was really, there was realignment going on, sort of thing, where you might have seen actually a fragmentation of the Republican Party going on. So, certainly, internal party politics. That was something. In terms of national policy, though, I mean, on an international level, Hay still really kind of. Though they didn't seem to always get along, I think Hay still kind of ran foreign policy, or was the primary thing that Roosevelt was listening to in terms of foreign policy. In terms of domestic policy in the first term, I don't know, because Hay never really talked that much about domestic policy. How would he have? Because it was fairly early in, right? Roosevelt, for the most part, kept McKinley's cabinet, including Hay. But I mean, would Hay have gone to a different cabinet that would have had a whole different set of effects? That's an interesting question.
When it comes to Panama, which is with the Panama Canal, was one of the many important things that Theodore Roosevelt did. Of course, I mean, Hay was the driving force, at least in terms of international relations. It was all of those treaties are Hay treaties. And so you think that although at least the big one wasn't finished until 1903, so Roosevelt's death would have potentially impacted it, and I don't know how that would have impacted, given that we were having Panama supporting Panama's breakaway from Colombia. I don't know exactly what that looks like. Now, that's
something, though, going, because I keep talking about Bryan. If Bryan had been elected in 1904, he had a very different idea about how we treat neighbors down there. And it's possible that Bryan would have avoided all the banana wars. Yeah. All the interventions that we had in the early part of the century that really actually turned much of the North America against us, or much of the American continent against us, and all the things that the interventions in Cuba and in Haiti and in Nicaragua and Guatemala. I don't know that Bryan would have prevented the canal tree or would have abandoned the canal, but I mean he might have approached it in a way that was differently, that left less poor feelings about it. So I don't want to make it sound, it's kind of hard. It's hard when you're making these counterfactuals to say, the world would have been better if we killed Roosevelt. But it is possible that he dealing with our neighbors, he was not always very politic.
And later in life he serves in the Wilson administration and ends up leaving because he quits because he thinks that despite Wilson dragging his feet, he thinks that Wilson is not being he's being too friendly to England and not giving them both the the knocks that they deserve.
Yeah.
Right. So which is an interesting. It's hard to know exactly what that would what that says about William Jennings Bryan's.
So Brian was much more of an isolationist, and much more about. So I mean, that could have really changed the whole first part of the 20th century, which was an exciting part. We kind of forget that these days. We kind of think of the First and Second World War, but we were actually doing a lot at the time. So I mean, that's the argument. If Brian had been elected, when he ran in 96, that he might have avoided the whole Spanish-American War, and then we wouldn't have had the American Empire, and that might mean if we didn't have the Philippines, and maybe even Hawaii, because Brian was opposed to us annexing Hawaii, then we might not have ended up in the Second World War. So I mean, that's if we want to talk about Theodore Roosevelt dies, because Theodore Roosevelt dies, the party doesn't unify, and they don't have anybody all that popular in 1904, and so Brian decides to win, and that's the election that Brian wins. It's possible that the U.S. never enters the Second World War.
I mean,
that's how broad that might have been if that streetcar had been because they said they missed it by inches. That's not an unreasonable argument to make, because Brian was very different on the international stage. He was not the big stick guy that Theodore Roosevelt was.
That also brings up an interesting argument, or an interesting scenario. Roosevelt being responsible for the Great White Fleet, the opening of Japan to trade, especially with the United States, even though it definitely had implications where essentially Japan pretty much had to open up to the rest of the world. Because of the way that happened, the Japanese ended up being very, very close to the British, to the point where the Japanese decided they would build a world-class navy, and they did not turn to the United States, they turned to Great Britain. And when the opportunities arose for during the First World War, the Japanese at that point were definitely in cahoots.
Very pro-British.
Yeah, very pro-British.
Yeah. Actually, the Japanese Navy operated in the Mediterranean in the First World War, and the Japanese were allies in the First World War. Yeah, so that shift came later.
Yeah,
that's a great area for counterfactual too. Is that the relationship with Japan really fell apart in very different ways.
Yeah, and Japan basically, by going in and taking the German possessions in China, that has another ripple effect, if you will, in the alternate history, where the Great White Fleet never makes it to Japan. Instead, perhaps a British squadron shows up, or a German squadron
shows up in Japan,
and brings Japan kicking and screaming into contact or formal trade relations with the rest of the world. So there's
now, certainly if the U.S. doesn't stay in the Philippines, then there's the antagonism with Japan in the Pacific really kind of goes away, and it's likely we wouldn't have fought in that war. But those decisions were really made by McKinley before he died and before Roosevelt's action. I don't know if John Hay would have changed that or not, but it's true. I mean, the relationships with Japan is a really interesting way that goes, and certainly but on the Roosevelt negotiated the end of the Russo-Japanese War. He got the Nobel Peace Prize for that, which is, I guess another interesting question. If Roosevelt had been hit by that cart,
it's not there
is there someone else that pops in and negotiates the end of the Russo-Japanese War? Does it go on, or does it have a different outcome than it had? Because Roosevelt did things after as well. As well as, if Roosevelt wasn't running on that Bull Moose ticket, then the Republicans had a better chance maybe Wilson doesn't become president.
Yeah, which would definitely have changed things. I mean, Wilson's approach to World War I was defining for that era of, it's hard to know because at that point we're getting far enough out from Roosevelt.
But Theodore Roosevelt had a very direct impact on Woodrow Wilson's election.
That's true.
And that and he would have been there. So I mean, you could. It's not that far to see.
No, Wilson had a unique. He absolutely rocketed from some dude at a university to governor and then the president in incredibly short order. And it's maybe if the Democratic Party had say Bryan in 1904, then you don't suddenly need some hero to pop out.
You're right. I mean, so you're talking. I mean, the ripple effects are quite large, and they're specifically with Roosevelt because he became president early enough that he was able to run successfully for a second term, could have run for a third term, and then he also came back, and then he brought the Republicans together. He split the Republicans, so he has ripple effects that go well into the into at least the World War I.
He was certainly he was a hugely significant figure in the time. If we talk about the great man theory or how the various ways that we kind of talk about how things can change, certainly, I mean, I think if he died there in 1902, it's hard to say he would not be remembered the way he is now, simply because so much of his legend comes after that.
Came after that. I mean, I think he might be well remembered for having just become president and getting hit by a streetcar.
And he still was.
And we would probably remember that time that that we lost both the president and the vice president in short order.
And he still did the Rough Riders.
But he wouldn't be the legend that he is. Yeah, well, you're right. I mean, I guess there's a lot there. But so in some ways, he might be remembered as a legendary hero because in some ways. He was vilified by the Republicans for splitting the party there later. So, that's when we talk about counterfactuals. The great man theory is one of the problems with it. It says if you just remove a man, how much changes? And I think that's an interesting question because I'm not sure that a Hay administration would policy-wise have been all that different than a Roosevelt administration. But I mean, certainly. The fact that Hay couldn't have run for a second term, and the president has enough authority in the United States that without saying one person is driving all the policy, I don't think that it would have prevented the First World War. But I mean, there's reasonable arguments to say that had Roosevelt died, and had we then not been as had we ended up therefore with more of an isolationist in 1904, that we might not have entered the First World War. We might not have entered the First World War as quickly or under the same terms. And of course, the First World War impacts the Second World War. So it's not necessarily a great man theory just to say that he was at a pivotal point and at that point.
Now, I would like to. I think you can make the argument for the great man of history, at least in this one instance, and that is the appointment to the Supreme Court of Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr.
That is a fair point.
Because apparently the president of the Senate at the time was very much opposed to the appointment, and so the fact that Teddy Roosevelt was the man making the decision or making that initial nomination. That definitely did impact jurisprudential history.
That's a good point.
For decades,
literally.
Yeah.
In fact, you can argue for a century because Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. apparently is still the most quoted justice at the Supreme Court.
Yeah, if he doesn't become, and you think that John Hay might not be as interested in pushing that appointment, or he doesn't know how to work with Congress. He's never had to.
He might not have as much ability to get Congress to do something it doesn't want to do.
That could have been.
That's a very good point.
That would have. It's. I don't know if I know enough about legal history to really talk about all the ways that would have changed things, but gosh, without his opinions, I mean that's. That does absolutely alter.
Yeah, I do think that the Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr., perhaps his most important moment in history, was when he defined the extent of limits you can place on free speech, essentially that a man cannot shout fire in a crowded theater. So the imminent danger, the imminent danger principle. We'll have to look that up later.
Yeah.
But that was one of the things that certainly was the highlight of his jurisprudential career. However, he did play a huge role with the person that we'll be discussing later, in that Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. was a fairly consistent vote for the New Deal under Franklin Delano Roosevelt.
Yeah, which is an interesting question too. Yeah, Roosevelt. Well, that's another one. So, I mean, do we want to talk about Pierce
first? Let's go to Pierce because we have talked a little bit about him already, and he is an interesting position because he would have died before he ever was inaugurated.
Before he took office, So he was not the president, but the president-elect. And that's interesting because, of course, his vice president was at the time, dying of consumption in Cuba, and only lived a month after inauguration.
like 45
How
days.
would the nation have taken? I mean, if he had died in January, would the nation really have accepted inaugurating? Sorry, what's his name?
William Rufus King.
Yeah, Rufus King. King had been president of the Senate. I mean, he was a well-known guy, but he was clearly dying. I mean, he knew he was dying even before he took this. So would they have accepted? He never served. He never sat a day. He died before he took office, and then we are going to inaugurate a dying man, and then a month later, then we're going to accept. Of course, it's changed by then. And it's no longer going to the cabinet first. It goes to the president pro tem.
Which was David Atchison.
It's rather, we're out of order here. This is before the 1886 one. Yeah. So
who is someone who probably most people haven't heard of.
A horrible human being. He was pro-slavery, slave-owning Missourian who
he was very involved in the Bleeding Kansas debacle, and
he was. Yeah, I mean, he's the orchestrator of the massacre in Lawrence. And that's all an interesting story. But the thing is, in the end, even though Pierce was seen as more of a moderate, in the end, Pierce supported the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Yeah. In the end, Pierce recognized the pro-slavery legislators that Atchison had kind of installed there in Kansas. So even though they seem to have different policies, in the end, the places where you think that Atchison would have been most aggressive, Pierce ends up supporting those positions. So
the only question I have, honestly, is one of Pierce's problems was that while he supported the pro-slavery faction in Kansas, he never did it with enough force to end the bloodshed there. Mm-hmm. And I mean, mind you, that might have taken more bloodshed.
Would Atchison had sent the U.S. Army to make sure that Kansas was a slave
state? Right? And maybe that could have.
Maybe.
Of course, I do think that you're right. That ultimately, I don't think that changes. I mean, the Civil War still happens, and probably roughly the same way that it did. It's hard to see that given that their policies would have been at least significantly the same, that it would have been able to alter any of that. But it's an interesting question in terms of what I mean. That's if we talked about John Hay not having been elected, we had never gone to someone in the Senate either, and that would have been a different. No, that would have been a.
It's too well, and the one way it could have been different is that he might have been. I mean, just like LBJ was. I mean, he might have been much more effective at moving Congress. It's hard to say because even the Democrats were very split at the time. But internally, it's hard to say how much that would have changed because in the end, Pierce was kind of on Atchison's side through the whole time. And maybe they would have been less effective because it was the fact that Pierce and Atchison were able to work together. If Atchison had become president, then maybe he wouldn't have worked as well with the legislature. But it's also an interesting time in U.S. history because we are talking there about truly expansion. We are talking in the period of the Pierce administration of annexing Cuba. We're talking about annexing Guatemala. We support the filibuster and that going on. So is it possible that if Pierce had died in the train wreck, and of course there's another question too, I mean, would Pierce have been a different president if his son hadn't been killed in the train wreck too? And that's another one Benny Pierce might have come on and changed the whole world. It's hard to tell because he was 9. But I mean, the loss of Benny Pierce could be an interesting counterfactual if he had gone into politics or whatever. But if Pierce had died and Atchison had become president, might Cuba be a state of the Union? Never.
It's hard to know because, of course, we just don't know enough ultimately about Atchison's what he would have done as president.
As foreign policy, I mean, we had there was a lot of really crazy important stuff going on right there. Pierce was not a very powerful president. He wasn't a very active president. So maybe Atchison would have been less powerful because he hadn't been elected, or maybe he would have been more powerful because he'd been president of the Senate, or maybe he would have simply been more aggressive and less tentative than Pierce. And if that's true, it could have meant that the Civil War started sooner or started later. It could have meant that Kansas entered as a slave state as opposed to a free state. Yeah. But it also could have meant that we might have been more aggressive with our neighbors because we were really talking about it at the time. He wanted to annex Mexico or Texas, or make Texas a part of the Union. He wanted to. That's not fair to say. That's the stuff that was going on. A massive expansion of the Union. So we know Pierce was responsible for the Gadsden Purchase. It's probably his biggest legacy. Maybe Atchison doesn't do that, and maybe we don't have that chunk of Arizona, New Mexico now, or maybe Atchison is more aggressive and we have more, or maybe Atchison is willing to go to war with England over Oregon, and so there's a good question there, because Atchison seemed to be relatively more towards incorporating the territories, growing the states, and especially if he saw that as growing slave states, and might that have gone to a more muscular foreign policy that might end up that we are a union of 56 states as opposed to a union of 50 states. And might that meant that slavery extends for a while longer because we don't have the balance of power in Congress that allowed it to, because stuck us in the middle. I agree with you. I don't think it prevents the Civil War. I think if anything, it might have sparked the Civil War more quickly because he was that much more aggressive. But it might have been, the nation might have looked different by the time it went.
Well, it might also have changed exactly, the exact circumstances of how we went to war. And I mean, the South secedes because they have a president that they don't think is going to support their interests. Whereas if it feels like, it's going the other way around, you might see, as opposed to the South seceding, you might see the North secede or something like that, which certainly was within the realm of possibility if they decided that they were.
That's true, yeah. What if the South essentially gets a majority in Congress, then maybe it's the North that secedes from the Union. That's an interesting question. That's an interesting question.
That certainly changes.
Because who Secretary of War was under Franklin Pierce?
Yeah, Jefferson Davis.
Yeah. Jefferson Davis. Yeah.
I was just reading.
So. Yeah, so this brings up...
That's a great counterfactual there. If Pierce had died in the train wreck, it's the North that secedes from the Union.
Because Jefferson Davis succeeds to the presidency.
Oh, yeah, that's true,
Wow, that's...
So, now we're going out on a limb. I do think that there is... I want to throw a couple of things in on the Gadsden Purchase. A lot of the history of the Gadsden Purchase, obviously, it focuses on we are acquiring this territory, and one of the primary reasons is, of course, because the South desperately wants to be the region that completes the Transcontinental Railroad.
The Transcontinental Railroad. Atchison wants the central route. He built Atchison, Kansas. So that's a good point. Atchison would have had much less incentive, despite being a more pro-Confederate. He would have had much less incentive to purchase the Gadsden Purchase because he wanted the central route because it was going to go straight through his money territory.
Yeah, and obviously that's tangentially, of course, to my point, is that is the reason that Bleeding Kansas occurs, is because the nation is ready to recognize that we have a very large chunk of essentially unincorporated area.
Well, it's the Kansas-Nebraska Act is because we have to incorporate those because we want to take the land to be able to build the Transcontinental Railroad. That's a fair point.
Yeah, and not only that, I mean, within the larger context of Manifest Destiny, which is definitely not tied to a single man. At that point,
absolutely,
it is very much a social and political movement in the United States. So we are.
It is, but I mean, what's preventing Kansas and Nebraska from entering the Union is the fear that if they both came in as slave states or they both came in as free states, you lose the balance in the Senate.
Exactly.
So Atchison assumed, because Atchison really pushed the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which got rid of the compromise. Atchison is assuming that Kansas is going to be populated by slaveholders and Nebraska is going to be populated by free soilers. And it turns out that no one from the South is really bothering to go there. And it looks like they both might come in. They both might, through popular sovereignty, come in as free states, and that upsets the balance of power. And Atchison, therefore, decides he's going to turn Kansas a slave state. Yeah, that's part of the big fight.
Which is just an I mean, the elections that go on in Kansas they were just so completely riddled with fraud on all sides that nothing was. I don't know if you can say. But
in the end, Pierce comes up to Atchison's side throughout bloody Kansas. So I don't know how much that changes things or not. But I mean, obviously, Atchison would have been more aggressive as president and maybe used the military or something to change what's going on in Kansas.
Yeah, and also if the southern route is chosen, ultimately what happens is that the Southern Pacific Railroad becomes the kingmaker, if you will, of at least one half of the transcontinental empire, which leads into some very powerful and well-connected men, the study of the Transcontinental Railroad and the various players.
It does, yeah. As opposed, though, to the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe, which ends up having all the power because you do the central route. So it seems to me that if Pierce died and Atchison became president, we are more likely to go the central route than the southern route. And since Pierce was there, we ended up with the central route anyway. So I don't know. But where it was really the decision there, though, was the South versus the North in terms of the balance of power in Congress. And so, who knows if you shift the balance through, Kansas, then wouldn't that have moved it to the southern route? Because, that Kansas would be voting against its interest if it's voting with the South on a southern route, because, obviously they want the railroad to go through Kansas. So I don't know. I don't know if Pierce dies, if we're more likely to go this. It feels to me that if Pierce dies, we probably would have started the central route sooner, because in the end we started the central route because the Civil War started and all the Confederates left the Congress, and we're like,
what are you going to? Well, and the South didn't have the resources to build their own route at that point, so
and
but that is certainly there's you're right. We might not have done the Gadsden Purchase because Atchison wouldn't have been interested in the southern route. Yeah. But that is the big decision of the time, is where in the end that might be more weighty than the Civil War, was the decision on where we put the Transcontinental Railroad. So anything changing in that period could certainly impact dramatically how the nation grew, because the Transcontinental Railroad route was going to totally transform that.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the History Guy podcast. We hope you enjoyed this episode of Counterfactual History, and if you did, you can find lots more history if you follow The History Guy on YouTube. You can also find us at thehistoryguy.com, Facebook, Patreon, and Locals. If you want to hear more Counterfactuals, stay tuned. We release podcasts every 2 weeks.